Chapter 5 of My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 5. In the hurry of the moment, I scarce knew what I did. I bade the housekeeper put up every delicacy she had, in order to tempt the invalid, whom yet I hoped to bring back with me to our house. When the carriage was ready, I took the good woman with me to show us the exact way, which my coachman professed not to know. For indeed they were staying at but a poor kind of place at the back of Leicester Square, of which they had heard, as Clement told me afterwards, from one of the fishermen, who had carried them across from the Dutch coast, in their disguises as a Friesland peasant and his mother. They had some jewels of value concealed round their persons, but their ready money was all spent before I saw them, and Clement had been unwilling to leave his mother, even for the time necessary to ascertain the best mode of disposing of the diamonds; for, overcome with distress of mind and bodily fatigue, she had reached London only to take to her bed in a sort of low nervous fever, in which her chief and only idea seemed to be that Clement was about to be taken from her to some sort of prison or other, and if he were out of her sight, though but for a minute, she cried like a child, and could not be pacified or comforted. The landlady was a kind, good woman, and though she but half understood the case, she was truly sorry for them as foreigners, and the mother sick in a strange land. I sent her forwards to request permission for my entrance. In a moment I saw Clement, a tall, elegant young man, in a curious dress of coarse cloth, standing at the open of a door, and evidently, even before he accosted me, striving to soothe the terrors of his mother inside. I went towards him, and would have taken his hand, but he bent down and kissed mine. "May I come in, madame?" I asked, looking at the poor sick lady, lying in the dark dingy bed, her head propped up on coarse and dirty pillows, and gazing with affrighted eyes at all that was going on. "Clement, Clement, come to me!" she cried, and when he went to her bedside, she turned on one side, and took his hand in both of hers, and began stroking it, and looking up into his face. I could scarce keep back my tears. He stood there quite still, except that from time to time he spoke to her in a low tone. At last I advanced into the room so that I could talk to him without renewing her alarm. I asked for the doctor's address, for I had learned that they had called in some one at their landlady's recommendation, but I could hardly understand Clement's broken English and mispronunciation of our proper names, and was obliged to apply to the woman herself. I could not say much to Clement, for his attention was perpetually needed by his mother, who never seemed to perceive that I was there, but I told him not to fear, however long I might be away, for that I would return before night, and bidding the woman take charge of all the heterogeneous things the housekeeper had put up, and leaving one of my men in the house who could understand a few words of French, with directions that he should hold himself at Madame de Crequy's orders until I sent or gave him fresh commands, I drove off to the doctor's. What I wanted was his permission to remove Madame de Crequy to my own house, and to learn how it might best be done, for I saw that every movement in the room, every sound except Clement's voice, brought on fresh access of trembling and nervous agitation. The doctor was, I should think, a clever man, but he had that kind of abrupt manner which people get who have much to do with the lower orders. I told him the story of his patient, the interest I had in her, and the wish I entertained of removing her to my own house. "It can't be done," said he. "Any change will kill her." "But it must be done," I replied, "and it shall not kill her." "Then I have nothing more to say," said he, turning away from the carriage door, and making as though he would go back into the house. "Stop a minute. You must help me, and if you do, you shall have reason to be glad, for I shall give you £50 down, with pleasure. If you won't do it, another shall." He looked at me, then furtively at the carriage door, hesitated, and then said: "You do not mind expense, apparently. I suppose you are a rich lady of quality. Such folks do not stick at such trifles as the life or death of a sick woman to get their own way. I suppose I must e'en help you, for if I don't, another will." I did not mind what he said so that he would assist me. I was pretty sure that she was in a state to require opiates, and I had not forgotten Christopher Sly, you may be sure, so I told him what I had in my head, that in the dead of night, the quiet time in the streets, she should be carried in a hospital litter, softly and warmly covered over, from the Leicester Square lodging house to rooms that I would have in perfect readiness for her. As I planned, so it was done. I let Clement know by a note of my design. I had all prepared at home, and we walked about my house as though shod with velvet, while the porter watched at the open door. At last, through the darkness, I saw the lanterns carried by my men, who were leading the little procession. The litter looked like a hearse. On one side walked the doctor, on the other Clement. They came softly and swiftly along. I could try no further experiment. We dared not change her clothes. She was laid in the bed in the landlady's coarse night gear, and covered over warmly, and left in the shaded, scented room, with the nurse and the doctor watching by her, while I led Clement to the dressing room adjoining, in which I had had a bed placed for him. Farther than that he would not go, and there I had refreshments brought. Meanwhile he had shown his gratitude at every possible action, for none of us dared to speak. He had kneeled at my feet, and kissed my hand, and left it wet with his tears. He had thrown up his arms to heaven, and prayed earnestly, as I could see by the movements of his lips. I allowed him to relieve himself by these dumb expressions, if I may so call them, and then I left him, and went to my own rooms to sit up for my lord, and tell him what I had done. Of course it was all right, and neither my lord nor I could sleep for wondering how Madame de Crequy would bear her awakening. I had engaged the doctor, to whose face and voice she was accustomed, to remain with her all night. The nurse was experienced, and Clement was within call, but it was with the greatest relief that I heard from my own woman, when she brought me my chocolate, that Madame de Crequy, monsieur had said, had awakened more tranquil than she had been for many days. To be sure, the whole aspect of the bedchamber must have been more familiar to her than that miserable place where I had found her, and she must have intuitively felt herself among friends. My lord was scandalized at Clement's dress, which, after the first moment of seeing him, I had forgotten, in thinking of other things, and for which I had not prepared Lord Ludlow. He sent for his own tailor, and bade him bring patterns of stuff, and engage his men to work night and day till Clement could appear as became his rank. In short, in a few days so much of the traces of their flight were removed, that we had almost forgotten the terrible causes of it, and rather felt as if they had come on a visit to us, than that they had been compelled to fly their country. Their diamonds, too, were sold well by my lord's agents, though the London shops were stocked with jewellery and such portable values, some of rare and curious fashion, which were sold at half their real value by emigrants who could not afford to wait. Madame de Crequy was recovering her health, although her strength was sadly gone, and she would never be equal to such another flight as the perilous one which she had just gone through, and to which she could not bear the slightest reference. For some time things continued in this state. The De Crequys still are honoured visitors. Many houses besides our own, even among our own friends, opened to receive the poor flying nobility of France, driven from their country by the brutal republicans, and every freshly arrived emigrant bringing new tales of horror, as if these revolutionists were drunk with blood, and mad to devise new atrocities. One day Clement—I should tell you that he had been presented to our good King George and the sweet Queen, and they had accosted him most graciously, and his beauty and elegance, and some of the circumstances attendant on his flight, made him be received in the world quite like a hero of romance. He might have been on intimate terms in many a distinguished house, had he cared much to visit, but he accompanied my lord and me with an air of indifference and languor, which I sometimes fancied made him be all the more sought after. Monkshaven, that was the title my eldest son bore, tried in vain to interest him in all young men's sports. But no, it was the same through all. His mother took far more interest in the on dits of the London world, into which she was far too great an invalid to venture, than he did in the absolute events themselves, in which he might have been an actor. One day, as I was saying, an old Frenchman of humble class presented himself to our servants. Several of them understood French, and through Medlicott I learnt that he was in some way connected with the De Crequys, not in their Paris life, but I fancy that he had been intendant of their estates in the country, estates which were more useful as hunting grounds than as adding to their income. However, there was the old man, and with him, wrapped round his person, he had brought the long parchment rolls, and deeds relating to their property. These he would deliver up to none but Monsieur de Crequy, the rightful owner, and Clement was out with Monkshaven, so the old man waited, and when Clement came in, I told him of the steward's arrival, and how he had been cared for by my people. Clement went directly to see him. He was a long time away, and I was waiting for him to drive out with me for some purpose or another. I scarce know what now, but I remember I was tired of waiting, and was just in the act of ringing the bell to desire that he might be reminded of his engagement with me, when he came in, his face as white as the powder in his hair, his beautiful eyes dilated with horror. I saw that he had heard something that touched him even more closely than the usual tales which every fresh emigrant brought. "What is it, Clement?" I asked. He clasped his hands, and looked as though he tried to speak, but could not bring out the words. "They have guillotined my uncle," said he at last. Now I knew that there was a Count de Crequy, but I had always understood that the elder branch had very little communication with him, in fact that he was a vaurien of some kind, and rather a disgrace than otherwise to the family. So perhaps I was hard-hearted, but I was a little surprised at this excess of emotion, till I saw that this particular look in his eye that many people have when there is more terror in their hearts than they dare put into words. He wanted me to understand something without his saying it, but how could I? I had never heard of a Mademoiselle de Crequy. "Virginie," at last he uttered. In an instant I understood it all, and remembered that if Urian had lived, he too might have been in love. "Your uncle's daughter?" I inquired. "My cousin," he replied. I did not say your betrothed, but I had no doubt of it. I was mistaken, however. "Oh, madame," he continued, "her mother died long ago, her father now, and she is in daily fear, alone, deserted." "Is she in the abbey?" asked I. "No, she is in hiding with the widow of her father's old concierge. Any day they may search the house for aristocrats, they are seeking them everywhere. Then not her life alone, but that of the old woman, her hostess, is sacrificed. The old woman knows this and trembles with fear. Even if she is brave enough to be faithful, her fears would betray her, should the house be searched. Yet there is no one to help Virginie to escape. She is alone in Paris." I saw what was in his mind. He was fretting and chafing to go to his cousin's assistance, but the thought of his mother restrained him. I would not have kept back Urian from such an errand at such a time. How should I restrain him? And yet perhaps I did wrong in not urging the chances of danger more. Still, if it was danger to him, was it not the same or even greater danger to her? For the French spared neither age nor sex in those wicked days of terror. So I rather fell in with his wish, and encouraged him to think how best and most prudently it might be fulfilled, never doubting, as I have said, that he and his cousin were troth plighted. But when I went to see Madame de Crequy, after he had imparted his, or rather our plan for her, I found out my mistake. She, who was in general too feeble to walk across a room save slowly and with a stick, was going from end to end with quick tottering steps, and if now and then she sank upon a chair, it seemed as if she could not rest, for she was up again in a moment, pacing along, wringing her hands, and speaking rapidly to herself. When she saw me, she stopped. "Madame," she said, "you have lost your own boy, you might have left me mine." I was so astonished, I hardly knew what to say. I had spoken to Clement as if his mother's consent were secure, as I had felt my own would have been if Urian had been alive to ask it. Of course, both he and I knew that his mother's consent must be asked and obtained before he could leave her to go on such an undertaking, but somehow my blood always rose at the sight or sound of danger, perhaps because my life had always been so peaceful. Poor Madame de Crequy! It was otherwise for her. She despaired while I hoped, and Clement trusted. "Dear Madame de Crequy," said I, "he will return safely to us. Every precaution shall be taken that either he, or you, or my lord, or Monkshaven can think of. But he cannot leave a girl, his nearest relation save you, his betrothed, is she not?" "His betrothed!" cried she, now at the utmost pitch of her excitement. "Virginie betrothed to Clement! No, thank heaven, not so bad as that, yet it might have been. But mademoiselle scorned my son. She would have nothing to do with him. Now is the time for him to have nothing to do with her." Clement had entered at the door behind his mother as she thus spoke. His face was set and pale, till it looked as grey and immovable as if it had been carved in stone. He came forward and stood before his mother. She stopped her walk, threw back her haughty head, and the two looked at each other steadily in the face. After a minute or two in this attitude, her proud and resolute gaze never flinching or wavering, he went down upon one knee, and taking her hand, her hard stony hand, which never closed on his, but remained straight and stiff, "Mother," he pleaded, "withdraw your prohibition. Let me go." "What were her words?" Madame de Crequy replied, slowly, as if forcing her memory to the extreme of accuracy. "My cousin," she said, "when I marry a man, not a petit maître. I marry a man who, whatever his rank may be, will add dignity to the human race by his virtues, and not be content to live in an effeminate court on the traditions of past grandeur." She borrowed her words from the infamous Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the friend of her scarce less infamous father. Nay, I will say it, if not her words, she borrowed her principles. And my son to request to marry her! "It was my father's written wish," said Clement. "But did you not love her? You plead your father's words, words written 12 years before, and as if it were your reason for being indifferent at my dislike to the alliance, and you requested her to marry you, and she refused you with insolent contempt, and now you are ready to leave me desolate in a foreign land. Desolate, my mother! And there the Countess Ludlow stands there. Pardon, madame, but all the earth, though it were full of kind hearts, is but a desolation and a desert place to a mother, when her only child is absent. And you, Clement, would leave me for this Virginie, this degenerate de Crequy, tainted with the atheism of encyclopédists. She is only reaping some of the fruit of the harvest whereof her friends have sown the seed. Let her alone. Doubtless she has friends, it may be lovers, among these demons who have, under the cry of liberty, committed every licence. Let her alone, Clement. She refused you with scorn. Be too proud to know her now." "Mother, I cannot think of myself, only of her." "Think of me, then. I, your mother, forbid you to go." Clement bowed low, and went out of the room instantly, as one blinded. She saw his groping movement, and for an instant I think her heart was touched. But she turned to me, and tried to exculpate her past violence by dilating upon her wrongs, and they certainly were many. The Count, her husband's younger brother, had invariably tried to make mischief between husband and wife. He had been the cleverer man of the two, and had possessed extraordinary influence over her husband. She suspected him of having instigated that clause of her husband's will, by which the Marquis expressed his wish for the marriage of the cousins. The Count had had some interest in the management of the De Crequy property during her son's minority. Indeed, I remembered then that it was through the Count de Crequy that Lord Ludlow had first heard of the apartment which we afterwards took in the Hôtel de Crequy. And then the recollection of a past feeling came distinctly out of the mist, as it were, and I called to mind how, when we first took up our abode in the Hôtel de Crequy, both Lord Ludlow and I imagined that our arrangement was displeasing to our hostess, and how it had taken a considerable time before we had been able to establish relations of friendship with her. Years after our visit, she began to suspect that Clement, whom she could not forbid to visit his uncle's house, considering the terms on which his father had been with his brother, though she herself had never set foot over the Count de Crequy's threshold, was attaching himself to Mademoiselle his cousin, and she made cautious inquiries as to the appearance, character, and disposition of the young lady. Mademoiselle was not handsome, they said, but of a fine figure, and generally considered as having a very noble and attractive presence. In character she was daring and wilful, said one set; original and independent, said another. She was much indulged by her father, who had given her something of a man's education, and selected for her intimate friend a young lady below her in rank, one of the bureaucracy, a Mademoiselle Necker, daughter of the Minister of Finance. Mademoiselle de Crequy was thus introduced into all the free-thinking salons of Paris, among people who were always full of plans for subverting society. And did Clement affect such people? Madame de Crequy had asked with some anxiety. No. Monsieur de Crequy had neither eyes nor ears nor thought for anything but his cousin while she was by. And she hardly took notice of his devotion, so evident to everyone else, the proud creature. But perhaps that was her haughty way of concealing what she felt, and so Madame de Crequy listened and questioned, and learnt nothing decided, until one day she surprised Clement with a note in his hand, of which she remembered the stinging words so well, in which Virginie had said, in reply to a proposal Clement had sent to her through her father, that when she married a man, not a petit maitre. Clement was justly indignant at the insulting nature of the answer Virginie had sent to a proposal respectful in its tone, and which was, after all, but the cool, hardened lava over a burning heart. He acquiesced in his mother's desire that he should not again present himself in his uncle's salons, but he did not forget Virginie, although he never mentioned her name. Madame de Crequy and her son were among the earliest proscrits, and they were of the strongest possible royalists and aristocrats, as it was the custom of the horrid sans-culottes to term those who adhered to the habits and expression and action in which it was their pride to have been educated. They had left Paris some weeks before they had arrived in England, and Clement's belief at the time of quitting the Hôtel de Crequy had certainly been that his uncle was not merely safe, but rather a popular man with a party in power, and as all communication having relation to private individuals of a reliable kind was intercepted, Monsieur de Crequy had felt but little anxiety for his uncle and cousin, in comparison with what he did for many other friends of very different opinions in politics, until the day when he was stunned by the fatal information that even his progressive uncle was guillotined, and learnt that his cousin was imprisoned by the license of the mob, whose rights, as she called them, she was always advocating. When I heard all this story, I confess I lost in sympathy for Clement what I gained for his mother. Virginie's life did not seem to me worth the risk that Clement would run. But when I saw him, sad, depressed, nay, hopeless, going about like one oppressed with a heavy dream, which he cannot shake off, caring neither to eat, drink, nor sleep, yet bearing all with silent dignity, and even trying to force a poor faint smile when he caught my anxious eyes, I turned round again, and wondered how Madame de Crequy could resist this mute pleading of her son's altered appearance. As for my Lord Ludlow and Monkshaven, as soon as they understood the case, they were indignant that any mother should attempt to keep a son out of honourable danger. And it was honourable, and a clear duty, according to them, to try to save the life of a helpless orphan girl, his next of kin. None but a Frenchman, said my lord, would hold himself back by an old woman's whimsies and fears, even though she were his mother. As it was, he was chafing himself to death under the restraint. If he went, to be sure the wretches might make an end of him, as they had done for many a fine fellow, but my lord would take heavy odds that, instead of being guillotined, he would save the girl, and bring her back to England, just desperately in love with her preserver, and then we would have a jolly wedding done at Monkshaven. My lord repeated his opinion so often that it became a certain prophecy in his mind of what was to take place, and one day, seeing Clement look even paler and thinner than he had ever done before, he sent a message to Madame de Crequy, requesting permission to speak with her in private. "For by George," said he, "she shall hear my opinion, and not let that lad of hers kill himself by fretting. He's too good for that. If he'd been an English lad, he'd been off to his sweetheart long before that, without saying, by your leave, or by your leave. But being a Frenchman, he's all for Aeneas and filial piety. Filial fiddlesticks!" My lord had run away to sea when he was a boy, against his father's consent, I am sorry to say, and as all had ended well, and he had come back to find both parents alive, I do not think he was ever as much aware of his fault as he might have been under other circumstances. "No, my lady," he went on, "don't come with me. A woman can manage a man best when he has a fit of obstinacy, and a man can persuade a woman out of her tantrums when all of her own sex, the whole army of them, would fail. Allow me to go alone with my tête-à-tête with madame." What he said, what passed, he never could repeat, but he came back graver than he went. However, the point was gained. Madame de Crequy withdrew her prohibition, and had given him leave to tell Clement as much. "But she is an old Cassandra," said he. "Don't let the lad be much with her. Her talk would destroy the courage of the bravest man. She is so given over to superstition. Something that she had said had touched a chord in my lord's nature which he inherited from his Scotch ancestors. Long afterwards I heard what this was. Medlicott told me. However, my lord shook off all fancies that told against the fulfilment of Clement's wishes. All that afternoon we three sat together planning, and Monkshaven passed in and out, executing our commissions, and preparing everything. Towards nightfall all was ready for Clement's start on his journey towards the coast. Madame had declined seeing any of us since my lord's stormy interview with her. She sent word that she was fatigued and desired repose, but of course before Clement set off he was bound to wish her farewell, and to ask her blessing. In order to avoid an agitating conversation between mother and son, my lord and I resolved to be present at the interview. Clement was all ready in his travelling dress, that of a Norman fisherman, which Monkshaven had with infinite trouble discovered in the possession of one of the émigrés who thronged London, and who had made his escape from the shores of France in this disguise. Clement was planning to go down to the coast of Sussex, and get some of the fishing or smuggling boats to take him across to the French coast near Dieppe. There again he would have to change his dress. Oh, it was so well planned. His mother was startled by his disguise, of which we had not thought to forewarn her, as he entered her apartment; and either that, or the being suddenly roused from her heavy slumber, into which she was apt to fall when she was left alone, gave her manner an air of wildness that was almost like insanity. "Go, go," she said to him, almost pushing him away as he knelt to kiss her hand. "Virginie is beckoning to you, but you don't see what kind of bed it is." "Clement, make haste," said my lord in a hurried manner, as if to interrupt madame. "The time is later than I thought, and you must not miss the morning's tide. Bid your mother good bye at once, and let's be off." For my lord and Monkshaven were to ride with him to an inn near the shore, from whence he was to walk to his destination. My lord almost took him by the arm to pull him away, and they were gone, and I was left alone with Madame de Crequy. When she heard the horse's feet, she seemed to find out the truth, as if for the first time. She set her teeth together. "He has left me for her," she almost screamed. "Left me for her," she kept muttering, and then, as the wild look came back into her eyes, she said, almost with exultation, "But I did not give him my blessing." Chapter 5.
Of My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Capricia Page. My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 6. All night Madame de Crequy raved in delirium. If I could, I would have sent for Clement back again. I did send off one man, but I suppose my directions were confused, or they were wrong, for he came back after my lord's return on the following afternoon. By this time Madame de Crequy was quieter. She was, indeed, asleep from exhaustion when Lord Ludlow and Monkshaven came in. They were in high spirits, and their hopefulness brought me round to a less dispirited state. All had gone well. They had accompanied Clement on foot along the shore, until they met with a lugger, which my lord had hailed in good nautical language. The captain had responded to these Freemason terms by sending a boat to pick up his passenger, and by an invitation to breakfast sent through a speaking trumpet. Monkshaven did not approve of either the meal or the company, and had returned to the inn, but my lord had gone with Clement and breakfasted on board, upon grog, biscuit, fresh-caught fish, the best breakfast he ever ate, he said, but that was probably owing to the appetite his night's ride had given him. However, his good fellowship had evidently won the captain's heart, and Clement had set sail under the best auspices. It was agreed that I should tell all this to Madame de Crequy if she inquired. Otherwise, it would be wiser not to renew her agitation by alluding to her son's journey. I sat with her constantly for many days, but she never spoke of Clement. She forced herself to talk of little occurrences of Parisian society in former days. She tried to be conversational and agreeable, and to betray no anxiety or even interest in the subject of Clement's journey, and as far as unremitting effort could go, she succeeded. But the tones of her voice were sharp and yet piteous, as if she were in constant pain. and the glance of her eye hurried and fearful, as if she dared not let it rest on any object. In a week we heard of Clement's safe arrival on the French coast. He sent a letter to this effect by the captain of the smuggler, when the latter returned. We hoped to hear again, but week after week elapsed, and there was no news of Clement. I had told Lord Ludlow, in Madame de Crequy's presence, as he and I had arranged, of the note I had received from her son, informing us of his landing in France. She heard, but she took no notice, and evidently began to wonder that we did not mention any further intelligence of him in the same manner before her. And daily I began to fear that her pride would give way, and that she would supplicate for news before I had any to give her. One morning, on my awakening, my maid told me that Madame de Crequy had passed a wretched night, and had bidden Medlicott, whom, as understanding French, and speaking it pretty well, though with that horrid German accent I had put about her, request that I should go to Madame's room as soon as I was dressed. I knew what was coming, and I trembled all the time they were doing my hair, and otherwise arranging me. I was not encouraged by my lord's speech. He had heard the message, and kept declaring that he would rather be shot than to have to tell her that there was no news of her son. And yet he said every now and then, when I was at the lowest pitch of uneasiness, that he never expected to hear again, that some day soon we should see him walking in and introducing Mademoiselle de Crequy to us. However, at last I was ready, and go I must. Her eyes were fixed on the door by which I entered. I went up to the bedside. She was not rouged, she had left it off now for several days. She no longer attempted to keep up the vain show of feeling, and loving, and fearing. For a moment or two she did not speak, and I was glad of the respite. "Clement," she said at length, covering her mouth with a handkerchief the minute she had spoken it, that I might not see it quiver, "there has been no news since the first letter, saying how well the voyage was performed, and how safely he had landed near Dieppe, you know." I replied as cheerfully as possible. "My lord does not expect that we shall have another letter. He thinks that we shall see him soon." There was no answer. As I looked, uncertain whether to do or say more, she slowly turned herself in bed, and lay with her face to the wall, and, as if that did not shut out the light of day and the busy, happy world enough, she put out her trembling hands and covered her face with her handkerchief. There was no violence, hardly any sound. I told her what my lord had said about Clement's coming in some day, and taking us all by surprise. I did not believe it myself, but it was just possible, and I had nothing else to say. Pity, to one who was striving so hard to conceal her feelings, would have been impertinent. She let me talk, but she did not reply. She knew that my words were vain and idle, and had no root in my belief, as well as I did myself. I was very thankful when Medlicott came in with Madame's breakfast, and gave me an excuse for leaving. But I think that conversation made me feel more anxious and impatient than ever. I felt almost pledged to Madame de Crequy for the fulfilment of the vision I had held out. She had taken entirely to her bed by this time, not from illness, but because she had no hope within her to stir her up to the effort of dressing. In the same way, she hardly cared for food. She had no appetite. Why eat to prolong a life of despair? But she let Medlicott feed her, sooner than take the trouble of resisting. And so it went on for weeks, months. I could hardly count the time, it seemed so long. Medlicott told me she noticed a preternatural sensitiveness of ear in Madame de Crequy, induced by the habit of listening silently for the slightest unusual sound in the house. Medlicott was always a minute watcher of anyone whom she cared about, and one day she made me notice by a sign of Madame's acuteness of hearing, although the quick expectation was but evinced for a moment in the turn of the eye, the hushed breath, and then, when the unusual footstep turned into my lord's apartments, the soft quivering sigh and the closed eyelids. At length the intendant of the De Crequys' estates, the old man, you will remember, whose information respecting Virginie de Crequy first gave Clement the desire to return to Paris, came to St. James's Square, and begged to speak to me. I made haste to go down to him in the housekeeper's room, sooner than he should be ushered into mine, for fear of Madame hearing any sound. The old man stood, I see him now, with his hand held before him in both hands. He slowly bowed till his face touched it, when I came in. So long excess of courtesy augured ill. He waited for me to speak. "Have you any intelligence?" I inquired. He had been often in the house before, to ask if we had received any news, and once or twice I had seen him, but this was the first time he had begged to see me. "Yes, madame," he replied, still standing with his head bent down, like a child in disgrace. "And it is bad!" I exclaimed. "It is bad." For a moment I was angry at the cold tone in which my words were echoed, but directly afterwards I saw the large, slow, heavy tears of age falling down the old man's cheeks, and on the upper sleeves of his poor threadbare coat. I asked him how he heard it. It seemed as though I could not all at once bear to hear what it was. He told me that the night before, in crossing Long Acre, he had stumbled upon an old acquaintance of his, one who, like himself, had been a dependent upon the De Crequy family, but had managed their Paris affairs, while Flechier had taken charge of their estates in the country. Both were now emigrants, and living on the proceeds of such small available talents as they possessed. Flechier, as I knew, earned a very fair livelihood by going about to dress salads for dinner parties. His compatriot, Lefebvre, had begun to give a few lessons as a dancing master. One of them took the other home to his lodgings, and there, when their most immediate personal adventures had been hastily talked over, came the inquiry from Flechier as to Monsieur de Crequy. Clement was dead, guillotined. Virginie was dead, guillotined. When Flechier had told me thus much, he could not speak for sobbing, and I myself could hardly tell how to restrain my tears sufficiently, until I could go to my own room and be at liberty to give way. He asked my leave to bring in his friend Lefebvre, who was walking in the square, awaiting a possible summons to tell his story. I heard afterwards a good many details which filled up the account, and made me feel, which brings me back to the point I started from, how unfit the lower orders are for being trusted indiscriminately with the dangerous powers of education. I have made a long preamble, but now I am coming to the moral of my story. The lady was trying to shake off the emotion which she evidently felt in recurring to this sad history of Monsieur de Crequy's death. She came behind me, and arranged my pillows, and then, seeing I had been crying, for indeed I was weak-spirited at the time, and a little served to unloose my tears, she stooped down and kissed my forehead, and said, "Poor child," almost as if she thanked me for feeling that old grief of hers. Being once in France, it was no difficult thing for Clement to get into Paris. The difficulty in those days was to leave, not to enter. He came in dressed as a Norman peasant, in charge of a load of fruit and vegetables, with which one of the Seine barges was freighted. He worked hard with his companions in landing and arranging their produce on the quays, and then, when they dispersed to get their breakfasts at some of the estaminets near the old Marché aux Fleurs, he sauntered up a street which conducted him, by many an odd turn, through the old Quartier à Latin, a horrid back alley, leading out of the Rue l'École de Médecine, some atrocious place, as I have heard, not far from the shadow of that terrible abbé, where so many of the best blood of France awaited their deaths. But here some old man lived, on whose fidelity Clement thought he might rely. I am not sure if he had not been gardener in those very gardens behind the Hotel Créquy, where Clement and Urian used to play together years before. But whatever the old man's dwelling might be, Clement was only too glad to reach it, you may be sure. He had been kept in Normandy in all sorts of disguises for many days after landing in Dieppe, through the difficulty of entering Paris unsuspected by the many ruffians who were always on the lookout for aristocrats. The old gardener was, I believe, both faithful and tired, and sheltered Clement in his garret as well as might be. Before he could start out, it was necessary to procure a fresh disguise, and one more in character with the inhabitants of Paris than that of a Norman carter was procured. And after waiting indoors for 1 or 2 days to see if any suspicion was excited, Clement set off to discover Virginie. He found her at the old concierge's dwelling. Madame Babette was the name of this woman, who must have been a less faithful, or rather, perhaps I should say, more interested, friend to her guest than the old gardener Jacques was to Clement. I have seen a miniature of Virginie, which a French lady of quality happened to have in her possession at the time of her flight from Paris, and which she brought with her to England unwittingly, for it belonged to the Count de Crequy, with whom she was slightly acquainted. I should fancy from it that Virginie was taller and of a more powerful figure for a woman than her cousin Clement was for a man. Her dark brown hair was arranged in short curls. The way of dressing the hair announced the politics of the individual in those days, just as patches did in my grandmother's time, and Virginie's hair was not to my taste, or according to my principles. It was too classical. Her large black eyes looked out at you steadily. One cannot judge the slope of a nose from a full face miniature, but the nostrils were clearly cut and largely open. I do not fancy her nose could have been pretty, but her mouth had a character all its own, and which would, I think, have redeemed a plainer face. It was wide and deep set into the cheeks at the corners. The upper lip was very much arched, and hardly closed over the teeth, so that the whole face looked, from the serious intent look in the eyes and the sweet intelligence of the mouth, as if she were listening eagerly to something to which her answer was quite ready, and would come out of those red opening lips as soon as ever you had done speaking, and you longed to know what she would say. Well, this Virginie de Crequy was living with Madame Babette in the conciergerie of an old French inn, somewhere in the north of Paris, so far enough from Clement's refuge. The inn had been frequented by farmers from Brittany and such kind of people, in the days when that sort of intercourse went on between Paris and the provinces which now had nearly stopped. Few Bretons came near it now, and the inn had fallen into the hands of Madame Babette's brother, as payment for a bad wine debt of the last proprietor. He put his sister and her child in, to keep it open, as it were, and sent all the people he could to occupy the half-furnished rooms of the house. They paid Babette for their lodging every morning, as they went out to breakfast, and returned or not as they chose at night. Every 3 days the wine merchant or his son came to Madame Babette, and she accounted to them for the money she had received. She and her child occupied the porter's office, in which the lad slept at nights, and a little miserable bedroom which opened out of it, and received all the light and air that was admitted through the door of communication, which was half glass. Madame Babette must have had a kind of attachment for the De Crequys. Her De Crequys, you understand, Virginie's father, the Count, for at some risk to herself she had warned both him and his daughter of the danger impending over them. But he, infatuated, would not believe that his dear human race could ever do him harm, and as long as he did not fear, Virginie was not afraid. It was by some ruse, the nature of which I never heard, that Madame Babette induced Virginie to come to her abode at the very hour in which the Count had been recognised in the streets, and hurried off to the Lanterne. It was after Babette had got her there, safe shut up in the little back den, that she told her what had befallen her father. From that day, Virginie never stirred out of the gates, or crossed the threshold of the porter's lodge. I do not say that Madame Babette was tired of her continual presence, or regretted the impulse which made her rush to the De Crequys' well-known house, after being compelled to form one of the mad crowds that saw the Count de Crequy seized and hung, and hurry his daughter out through the alleys and back ways, until at length she had the orphan safe in her own dark sleeping-room, and could tell her tale of horror. But Madame Babette was poorly paid for her porter's work by her avaricious brother, and it was hard enough to find food for herself and her growing boy, and though the poor girl ate little enough, I dare say, yet there seemed no end to the burthen that Madame Babette had imposed upon herself. The De Crequys were plundered, ruined, and had become an extinct race, all but a lovely, friendless girl, in broken health and spirits, and though she lent no positive encouragement to his suit, yet at the time when Clement reappeared in Paris, Madame Babette was beginning to think that Virginie might do worse than encourage the attentions of Monsieur Morin fils, her nephew, and the wine merchant's son. Of course he and his father had the entrée into the concierge of the hotel that belonged to them, in right of being both proprietors and relations. The son, Morin, had seen Virginie in this manner. He was fully aware that she was far above him in rank, and guessed from her whole aspect that she had lost her natural protectors by the terrible guillotine. But he did not know her exact name or station, nor could he persuade his aunt to tell him. However, he fell head over ears in love with her, whether she were princess or peasant, and though at first there was something about her which made his passionate love conceal itself with shy, awkward reserve, and then made it only appear in the guise of deep, respectful devotion, yet by and by the same process of reasoning, I suppose that his aunt had gone through even before him, Jean Morin began to let hope oust despair from his heart. Sometimes he thought, perhaps years hence, that solitary friendless lady, pent up in squalor, might turn to him as a friend and comforter, and then. Meanwhile Jean Morin was most attentive to his aunt, whom he had rather slighted before. He would linger over the accounts, would bring her little presents, and above all, he made a pet and favourite of Pierre, the little cousin, who could tell him all about the ways and going on of Mademoiselle Cannes, as Virginie was called. Pierre was thoroughly aware of the drift and cause of his cousin's inquiries, and was his ardent partisan, as I have heard, even before Jean Morin had exactly acknowledged his wishes to himself. It must have required some patience and much diplomacy before Clement de Crequy found out the exact place where his cousin was hidden. The old gardener took the cause very much to heart, as, judging from my recollections, I imagined he would have forwarded any fancy, however wild, of Monsieur Clement's. I will tell you afterwards how I came to know all these particulars as well. After Clement's return, on 2 succeeding days, from his dangerous search without meeting with any good result, Jacques entreated Monsieur de Crequy to let him take it in hand. He represented that he, as a gardener for the space of 20 years and more at the Hôtel de Crequy, had a right to be acquainted with all the successive concierges at the Count's house, that he should not go among them as a stranger, but as an old friend, anxious to renew pleasant intercourse, and that if the intendant's story, which he had told Monsieur de Crequy in England, was true, that mademoiselle was in hiding at the house of a former concierge, why, something relating to her would surely drop out in the course of conversation. So he persuaded Clement to remain indoors, while he set off his round, with no apparent object but to gossip. At night he came home, having seen mademoiselle. He told Clement much of the story relating to Madame Babette that I have told to you. Of course, he had heard nothing of the ambitious hopes of Morin hardly of his existence, I should think. Madame Babette had received him kindly, although for some time she had kept him standing in the carriage gateway, outside her door. But on his complaining of a draught and his rheumatism, she had asked him in, first looking round with some anxiety to see who was in the room behind her. No one was there when he entered and sat down, but in a minute or two a tall, thin young lady, with great sad eyes and pale cheeks, came from the inner room, and, seeing him, retired. "It is Mademoiselle Cannes," said Madame Babette, rather unnecessarily, for if he had not been on the watch for some sign of Mademoiselle de Crequy, he would hardly have noticed the entrance and withdrawal. Clement and the good old gardener were always rather perplexed by Madame Babette's evident avoidance of all mention of the de Crequy family. If she were so much interested in one member as to be willing to undergo the pains and penalties of a domiciliary visit, it was strange that she never inquired after the existence of her charge's friends and relations, from one who might very probably have heard something of them. They settled that Madame Babette must believe that the Marquise and Clement were dead, and admired her and her reticence in never speaking of Virginie. The truth was, I suspect, that she was so desirous of her nephew's success at the time, that she did not like letting anyone into the secret of Virginie's whereabouts who might interfere with their plan. However, it was arranged between Clement and his humble friend, that the former, dressed in the peasant's clothes in which he had entered Paris, but smartened up in one or two particulars, as if, although a countryman, he had money to spare, could go and engage a sleeping room in the old Breton inn, where, as I have told you, accommodation for the night was to be had. This was accordingly done, without exciting Madame Babette's suspicion, for she was unacquainted with the Normandy accent, and consequently did not perceive the exaggeration of it when Monsieur de Crequy adopted it in order to disguise his pure Parisian. But after he had for 2 nights slept in a queer dark closet at the end of one of the numerous short galleries in the Hôtel du Gaglin, and paid his money for such accommodation each morning at the little bureau under the window of the conciergerie, he found himself no nearer to his object. He stood outside in the gateway. Madame Babette opened a pane in her window, counted out the change, gave polite thanks, and shut to the pane with a clack. Before he could ever find out what to say, that might be a means of opening a conversation. Once in the streets, he was in danger from a bloodthirsty mob, who were ready in those days to hunt to death every one who looked like a gentleman, as an aristocrat. And Clement, depend upon it, looked like a gentleman, whatever dress he wore. Yet it was unwise to traverse Paris to his old friend the gardener's grenier. So he had to loiter about, where I hardly know. Only he did leave the Hotel du Guesclin, and he did not go to old Jacques, and there was not another house in Paris open to him. At the end of 2 days he had made out Pierre's existence, and he began to try to make friends with the lad. Pierre was too sharp and shrewd not to suspect something, from the confused attempts at friendliness. It was not for nothing that the Norman lounged in the court and doorway, and brought home presents of galette. Pierre accepted the galette, reciprocated the civil speeches, but kept his eyes open. Once, returning home pretty late at night, he surprised the Norman studying the shadows on the blind, which was drawn down when Madame Babette's lamp was lighted. On going in, he found Mademoiselle Cannes with his mother, sitting by the table and helping in the family mending. Pierre was afraid that the Norman had some view upon the money which his mother, as concierge, collected for her brother. But the money was all safe next evening, when his cousin, Monsieur Morin fils, came to collect it. Madame Babette asked her nephew to sit down, and skilfully barred the passage to the inner door, so that Virginie, had she been ever so much disposed, could not have retreated. She sat silently sewing. All at once the little party were startled by a very sweet tenor voice, just close to the street window, singing one of the airs out of Beaumarchais' opera, which a few years before had been popular all over Paris. But after a few moments of silence and one or two remarks, the talking went on again. Pierre, however, noticed an increased air of abstraction in Virginie, who, I suppose, was recurring to the last time that she had heard the song, and did not consider, as her cousin had hoped she would have done, what were the words set to that air, which he imagined she would do, and which would have told her so much. For only a few years before, Adam's opera of Richard le Roi had made the story of the minstrel Blondel in our English Coeur de Lion familiar to all the opera-going part of the Parisian public, and Clement had bethought him of establishing a communication with Virginie by some such means. The next night, about the same hour, the same voice was singing outside the window again. Pierre, who had been irritated by the proceeding the evening before, as it had diverted Virginie's attention from his cousin, who had been doing his utmost to make himself agreeable, rushed out to the door just as the Norman was ringing the bell to be admitted for the night. Pierre looked up and down the street. No one else was to be seen. The next day the Norman mollified him somewhat by knocking at the door of the conciergerie, and begging Monsieur Pierre's acceptance of some knee buckles, which had taken the country farmer's fancy the day before, as he had been gazing into the shops, but which, being too small for his purpose, he took the liberty of offering to Monsieur Pierre. Pierre, a French boy inclined to foppery, was charmed, ravished by the beauty of the present, and with Monsieur's goodness, and he began to adjust them to his breeches immediately, as well as he could, at least, in his mother's absence. The Norman, whom Pierre kept carefully on the outside of the threshold, stood by, as if amused by the boy's eagerness. "Take care," he said, clearly and distinctly. "Take care, my little friend, lest you become a fop, and in that case, some day, years hence, when your heart is devoted to some young lady, she may be inclined to say to you," here he raised his voice, "No, thank you. When I marry a man, not a petite maitre. I marry a man who, whatever his position may be, will add dignity to the human race by his virtues. Farther than that, in his quotation, Clement dared not go. His sentiments, so much above the apparent occasion, met with applause from Pierre, who liked to contemplate himself in the light of a lover, even though it should be a rejected one, and who hailed the mention of the words virtue and dignity of the human race as belonging to the cant of a good citizen. But Clement was more anxious to know how the invisible lady took his speech. There was no sign at the time, but when he returned at night, he heard a voice, low singing, behind Madame Babette, as she handed him his candle. The very air he had sung without effect for 2 nights past, as if he had caught it up from her murmuring voice. He sang it loudly and clearly as he crossed the court. "Here is our opera singer!" exclaimed Madame Babette. "Why, the Norman Grazier sings like Boupé," naming a favourite singer at the neighbouring theatre. Pierre was struck by the remark, and quietly resolved to look after the Norman, but again, I believe, it was more because of his mother's deposit of money than any thought of Virginie. However, the next morning, to the wonder of both mother and son, Mademoiselle Cannes proposed, with much hesitation, to go out and make some little purchase for herself. A month or 2 ago, this is what Madame Babette had been never weary of urging. But now she was as much surprised as if she had expected Virginie to remain a prisoner in her rooms all the rest of her life. I suppose she had hoped that her first time of quitting it would be when she left it for Monsieur Morin's house as his wife. A quick look from Madame Babette toward Pierre was all that was needed to encourage the boy to follow her. He went out cautiously. She was at the end of the street. She was looking up and down as if waiting for someone. No one was there. Back she came, so swiftly that she nearly caught Pierre before he could retreat through the porte cochere. There he looked out again. The neighbourhood was low and wild and strange, and someone spoke to Virginie, nay, laid his hand upon her arm. Whose dress and aspect he had emerged out of a side street, Pierre did not know, but after a start, and Pierre could fancy a little scream, Virginie recognised the stranger, and the two turned up a side street whence the man had come. Pierre stole swiftly to the corner of the street. No one was there. They had disappeared up some of the alleys. Pierre returned home to excite his mother's infinite surprise, but they had hardly done talking when Virginie returned, with a colour and radiance in her face which they had never seen there since her father's death. End of chapter 6. Recording by Capricia Page.
Of My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Capricia Page. My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell, Chapter 7. I have told you that I heard much of this story from a friend of the intendant of the De Crequys, whom he met with in London. Some years afterwards, the summer before my lord's death, I was travelling with him in Devonshire, and we went to see the French prisoners of war on Dartmoor. We fell into conversation with one of them, whom I found out to be the very Pierre of whom I had heard before, as having been involved in the fatal story of Clement and Virginie, and by him I was told much of their last days, and thus I learnt how to have some sympathy with all those who were concerned in those terrible events. Yes, even with the younger Morin himself, on whose behalf Pierre spoke warmly, even after so long a time had elapsed.
For when the younger Morin called at the porter's lodge, on the evening of the day when Virginie had gone out for the first time after so many months' confinement to the conciergerie, he was struck with the improvement in her appearance. It seems to have hardly been that he thought her beauty greater, for in addition to the fact that she was not beautiful, Morin had arrived at that point of being enamoured when it does not signify whether the beloved one is plain or handsome. She has enchanted one pair of eyes, which henceforth see her through their own medium. But Morin noticed the faint increase of colour and light in her countenance. It was as though she had broken through her thick cloud of hopeless sorrow, and was dawning forth into a happier life. And so, whereas during her grief he had revered and respected it even to a point of silent sympathy, now that she was gladdened, his heart rose on the wings of strength and hopes. Even in the dreary monotony of this existence in his Aunt Babette's conciergerie, time had not failed in his work. And now, perhaps, soon he might humbly strive to help time. The very next day he returned, on some pretence of business, to the Hôtel du Guesclin, and made his aunt's room, rather than his aunt herself, a present of some roses and geraniums tied up in a bouquet with a tricolour ribbon. Virginie was in the room, sitting at the coarse sewing she liked to do for Madame Babette. He saw her eyes brighten at the sight of the flowers. She asked his aunt to let her arrange them. He saw her untie the ribbon, and with a gesture of dislike throw it on the ground, and give it a kick with her little foot. And even in this girlish manner of insulting his dearest prejudices, he found something to admire. As he was coming out, Pierre stopped him. The lad had been trying to arrest his cousin's attention by futile grimaces and signs, playing off behind Virginie's back. But Monsieur Morin saw nothing but Mademoiselle Cannes. However, Pierre was not to be baffled, and Monsieur Morin found him in waiting just outside the threshold. With his finger on his lips, Pierre walked on tiptoe by his companion's side, till they would have been long past sight or hearing of the conciergerie, even had the inhabitants devoted themselves to the purposes of spying or listening. "Chut!" said Pierre at last. "She goes out walking." "Well?" said Monsieur Morin, half curious, half annoyed at being disturbed in the delicious reverie of the future into which he longed to fall. "Well, it is not well, it is bad." "Why? I do not ask who she is, but I have my ideas. She is an aristocrat. Do the people about here begin to suspect?" "No, no," said Pierre. "But she goes out walking. She has gone these 2 mornings. I have watched her. She meets a man. She's friends with him, for she talks to him as eagerly as he does to her. Mamma cannot tell who he is." "Has my aunt seen him?" "No, not so much as a fly's wing of him. I myself have only seen his back. It strikes me like a familiar back, and yet I cannot think who it is. But they separate with sudden darts, like 2 birds who have been together to feed their young ones. One moment they are in close talk, their heads together, chuckling. The next he has turned up some by-street, and Mademoiselle Cannes is close upon me, has almost caught me." "But she did not see you?" inquired Monsieur Morin, in so altered a tone that Pierre gave him one of his quick penetrating looks. He was struck by the way in which his cousin's features, always coarse and commonplace, had been contracted and pinched, struck too by the livid look on his sallow complexion. But as if Morin was conscious of the manner in which his face belied his feelings, he made an effort, and smiled, and patted Pierre's head, and thanked him for his intelligence, and gave him a 5-franc piece, and bade him go on with his observations of Mademoiselle Cannes' movements, and report all to him. Pierre returned home with a light heart, tossing up his 5-franc piece as he ran. Just as he was at the conciergerie door, a great tall man bustled past him, and snatched his money away from him. looking back with a laugh which added insult to injury. Pierre had no redress. No one had witnessed the impudent theft, and if they had, no one to be seen in the street was strong enough to give him redress. Besides, Pierre had seen enough of the state of the streets of Paris at that time to know that friends, not enemies, were required, and the man had a bad air about him. But all these considerations did not keep Pierre from bursting out into a fit of crying when he was once more under his mother's roof. And Virginie, who was alone there, Madame Babette having gone out to make her daily purchases, might have imagined him pummelled to death by the loudness of his sobs. "What is the matter?" asked she. "Speak, my child, what hast thou done?" "He has robbed me, he has robbed me," was all Pierre could gulp out. "Robbed thee, and of what, my poor boy?" said Virginie, stroking his hair gently. "Of my 5-franc piece, of a 5-franc piece," said Pierre, correcting himself, and leaving out the word my, half fearful lest Virginie should inquire how he came possessed of such a sum, and for what services it had been given him. But of course no such idea came into her head, for it would have been impertinent, and she was gentle born. "Wait a moment, my lad," and going into one small drawer in the inner apartment, which held all her few possessions, she brought back a little ring, a ring with just one ruby in it, which she had worn in the days when she cared to wear jewels. "Take this," said she, "and run with it to a jeweller's. It is but a poor, valueless thing, but it will bring you in your 5 francs at any rate. Go, I desire you." "But I cannot," said the boy, hesitating, some dim sense of honour flitting through his misty morals. "Yes, you must," she continued, urging him with her hand on the door. "Run. If it brings in more than 5 francs, you shall return the surplus to me." Thus tempted by her urgency, and, I suppose, reasoning with himself to the effect that he might as well have the money, and then see whether he thought it right to act as a spy upon her or not, the one action did not pledge him to the other, nor yet did she make any conditions with her gift. Pierre went off with her ring, and after repaying himself his 5 francs, he was enabled to bring Virginie back 2 more, so well he had managed his affairs. But although the whole transaction did not leave him bound in any way to discover or forward Virginie's wishes, it did leave him pledged, according to his code, to act according to her advantage, and he considered himself the judge over the best course to be pursued to this end. And moreover, this little kindness attached him to her personally. He began to think how pleasant it would be to have so kind and generous a person for a relation. How easily his troubles might be borne if he had always such a ready helper at hand. How much he should like to make her like him, and come to him for the protection of his masculine power. First of all his duties, as her self-appointed squire, came the necessity of finding out who her strange new acquaintance was. Thus, you see, he arrived at the same end, via supposed duty, that he was previously pledged to via interest. I fancy a good number of us, when any line of action will promote our own interest, can make ourselves believe that reasons exist which compel us to do it as a duty. In the course of a very few days, Pierre had so circumvented Virginie as to have discovered that her new friend was no other than the Norman farmer, in different dress. This was a great piece of knowledge to impart to Morin, but Pierre was not prepared for the immediate physical effect it had on his cousin. Morin sat silently down on one of the seats in the boudoir. It was there Pierre had met with him accidentally, when he heard who it was that Virginie met. I do not suppose the man had the faintest idea of any relationship, or even previous acquaintanceship between Clement and Virginie. If he thought of anything beyond the mere fact presented to him, that his idol was in communication with another, younger, handsomer man than himself, it must have been that the Norman farmer had seen her at the conciergerie, and had been attracted by her, and, as was but natural, had tried to make her acquaintance, and had succeeded. But from what Pierre told me, I should not think that even this much thought passed through Morin's mind. He seemed to have been a man of rare and concentrated attachments, violent, though restrained and undemonstrative passions, and above all, a capability of jealousy, of which his dark Oriental complexion must have been a type. I could fancy that if he had married Virginie, he would have coined his life blood for luxuries to make her happy, would have watched over and petted her, at every sacrifice to himself, as long as she would have been content to live with him alone. But as Pierre expressed it to me, when I saw what my cousin was, when I learned his nature too late, I perceived that he would have strangled a bird, if she whom he loved was attracted by it from him. When Pierre had told Morin of his discovery, Morin sat down, as I said, quite suddenly, as if he had been shot. He found out that the first meeting between the Norman and Virginie was no accidental, isolated circumstance. Pierre was torturing him with his accounts of daily rendezvous. If but for a moment, they were seeing each other every day, sometimes twice a day, and Virginie could speak to this man, though to himself he was coy and reserved, as hardly to utter a sentence. Pierre caught these broken words, while his cousin's complexion grew more and more livid, and then purple, as if some great effect were produced upon his circulation by the news he had just heard. Pierre was so startled by his cousin's wandering, senseless eyes, and otherwise disordered looks, that he rushed into a neighbouring cabaret for a glass of absinthe, which he paid for, as he recollected afterwards, with a portion of Virginie's 5 francs. By and by Morin recovered his natural appearance, but he was gloomy and silent, and all that Pierre could get out of him was, that the Norman farmer should not sleep another night at the Hôtel du Guesclin, giving him such opportunities of passing and repassing by the Conciergerie d'Or. He was too much absorbed in his own thoughts to repay Pierre the half-franc he had spent on the absinthe, which Pierre perceived, and seems to have noted down in the ledger of his mind, as on Virginie's balance of favour. Altogether, he was much disappointed at his cousin's mood of receiving intelligence, which the lad thought worth another 5-franc piece at least, or, if not paid for in money, to be paid for in open-mouthed confidence, an expression of feeling, that he was for a time so far a partisan of Virginie's unconscious Virginie against his cousin, as to feel regret when the Norman returned no more to his night's lodging, and when Virginie's eager watch at the crevice of the closely drawn blinds ended only with a sigh of disappointment. If it had not been for his mother's presence at the time, Pierre thought he should have told her all. But how far was his mother in his cousin's confidence as regarded the dismissal of the Norman? In a few days, however, Pierre felt almost sure that they had established some new means of communication. Virginie went out for a short time every day, but though Pierre followed her as closely as he could without exciting her observation, he was unable to discover what kind of intercourse she held with the Norman. She went, in general, the same short round along the little shops in the neighbourhood, not entering any, but stopping at 2 or 3. Pierre afterwards remembered that she had invariably paused at the nosegays displayed in a certain window, and studied them long. But then she stopped and looked at caps, hats, fashions, confectionery, all of the humble kind common in that quarter. So how should he have known that any particular attraction existed among the flowers? Morin came more regularly than ever to his aunt's, but Virginie was apparently unconscious that she was the attraction. She looked healthier and more hopeful than she had done for months, and her manners to all were gentler and not so reserved, almost as if she wished to manifest her gratitude to Madame Babette for her long continuance of kindness, the necessity for which was nearly ended. Virginie showed an unusual alacrity in rendering the old woman any little service in her power, and evidently tried to respond to Monsieur Morin's civilities, he being Madame Babette's nephew, with a soft graciousness which must have made one of her principal charms, for all who knew her spake of the fascination of her manners, so winning and attentive to others, while yet her opinions, and often her actions, were of so decided a character. For, as I have said, her beauty was by no means great, yet every man who came near her seems to have fallen into the sphere of her influence. Monsieur Morin was deeper than ever in love with her during these last few days. He was worked up into a state capable of any sacrifice, either of himself or others, so that he might obtain her at last. He sat devouring her with his eyes, to use Pierre's expression, whenever she could not see him, but if she looked towards him, he looked to the ground, anywhere, away from her, and almost stammered in his replies if she addressed him any question. He had been, I should think, ashamed of his extreme agitation on the boulevard, for Pierre thought that he absolutely shunned him for these few succeeding days. He must have believed that he had driven the Norman, my poor Clement, off the field, by banishing him from his inn, and thought that the intercourse between him and Virginie, which he had thus interrupted, was one of so slight and transient a character as to be quenched by a little difficulty. But he appeared to have felt that he had made but little way, and he awkwardly turned to Pierre for help, not yet confessing his love, though. He only tried to make friends again with the lad after their silent estrangement, and Pierre for some reason did not choose to perceive his cousin's advances. He would reply to all the roundabout questions Morin put to him respecting household conversations when he was not present, or household occupations and tone of thought, without mentioning Virginie's name any more than his questioner did. The lad would seem to suppose that his cousin's strong interest in their domestic ways of going on was all on account of Madame Babette. At last he worked his cousin up to the point of making him a confidant, and then the boy was half frightened at the torrents of vehement words he had unloosed. The lava came down with a greater rush for having been pent up so long. Morin cried out his words in a hoarse, passionate voice, clenched his teeth, his fingers, and seemed almost convulsed, as he spoke out his terrible love for Virginie, which would lead him to kill her sooner than see her another's, and if another stepped in between him and her, and then he smiled a fierce, triumphant smile, but did not say any more. Pierre was, as I said, half frightened, but also half admiring. This was really love, a grande passion, a really fine dramatic thing, like the plays they acted at the little theatre yonder. He had a dozen times the sympathy with his cousin now that he had had before, and readily swore by the infernal gods, for they were far too enlightened to believe in one God, or Christianity, or anything of the kind, that he would devote himself, body and soul, to forwarding his cousin's views. Then his cousin took him to a shop, and bought him a smart second-hand watch, on which they scratched the word Fidelité, and thus was the compact sealed. Pierre settled in his own mind that if he were a woman, he should like to be loved as Virginie was by his cousin, and that it would be an extremely good thing for her to be the wife of so rich a citizen as Morin fils, and for Pierre himself too, for doubtless their gratitude would lead them to give him rings and watches ad infinitum. A day or two afterwards Virginie was taken ill. Madame Babette said it was because she had persevered in going out in all weathers, after confining herself to 2 warm rooms for so long, and very probably this was the case, for, from Pierre's account, she must have been suffering from a feverish cold, aggravated no doubt by her impatience at Madame Babette's familiar prohibitions of any more walks until she was better. Every day, in spite of her trembling, aching limbs, she would fain have arranged her dress for her walk at the usual time, But Madame Babette was fully prepared to put physical obstacles in her way, if she was not obedient in remaining tranquil on the little sofa by the side of the fire. On the third day she called Pierre to her, when his mother was not attending, having in fact locked up Mademoiselle Cannes' out of door things. "See, my child," said Virginie, "thou must do me a great favour. Go to the gardener's shop in the Rue des Bons Chiffons, and look at the nosegays in the window. I long for pinks. They are my favourite flower. Here are 2 francs. If thou seest a nosegay of pinks displayed in the window, if it be ever so faded, nay, if thou seest 2 or 3 nosegays of pinks, remember, buy them all, and bring them to me. I have so great a desire for the smell." She fell back weak and exhausted. Pierre hurried out. Now was the time. Here was the clue to the long inspection of the nosegay in this very shop. Sure enough, there was a drooping nosegay of pinks in the window. Pierre went in, and with all his impatience he made as good a bargain as he could, urging that the flowers were faded and good for nothing. At last he purchased them at a very moderate price, and now you will learn the bad consequences of teaching the lower orders anything beyond what is immediately necessary to enable them to earn their daily bread. The silly Count de Crequy, who had been sent to his bloody rest by the very canaille of whom he thought so much, he who had made Virginie, indirectly it is true, reject such a man as her cousin Clement, by inflating her mind with his bubbles of theories, this Count de Crequy had long ago taken a fancy to Pierre, as he saw the bright sharp boy playing about his court. Monsieur de Crequy had even begun to educate the boy himself, to try to work out certain opinions of his into practice. But the drudgery of the affair wearied him, and besides, Babette had left his employment. Still the Count took a kind of interest in his former pupil, and made some sort of arrangement by which Pierre was to be taught reading and writing and accounts, and heaven knows what besides, Latin, I daresay. So Pierre, instead of being an innocent messenger as he ought to have been, as Mr. Horner's little lad Gregson ought to have been this morning, could read writing as well as either you or I. So what does he do, on obtaining the nosegay, but examine it well. The stalks of the flowers were tied up with slips of matting in wet moss. Pierre undid the strings, unwrapped the moss, and out fell a piece of wet paper, with the writing all blurred with moisture. It was but a torn piece of writing paper, apparently, but Pierre's wicked, mischievous eyes read what was written on it, written so as to look like a fragment. "Ready every and any night at 9. All is prepared. Have no fright. Trust one who, whatever hopes he might once have had, is content now to serve you as a faithful cousin." And a place was named, which I forget, but which Pierre did not, as it was evidently the rendezvous. After the lad had studied every word, till he could say it off by heart, he placed the paper where he had found it, enveloped it in moss, and tied the whole up again carefully. Virginie's face coloured scarlet as she received it. She kept smelling it and trembling, but she did not untie it, although Pierre suggested how much fresher it would be if the stalks were immediately put into water. But once, after his back had been turned for a minute, he saw it untied, when he looked around again, and Virginie was blushing, and hiding something in her bosom. Pierre was now all impatience to set off and find his cousin, but his mother seemed to want him for small domestic purposes even more than usual, and he had chafed over a multitude of errands connected with the hotel before he could set off in search of his cousin at his usual haunts. At last the two met, and Pierre related all the events of the morning to Morin. He said the note off, word by word. The lad this morning had something of that magpie look of Pierre. It made me shudder to see him, and hear him repeat the note by heart. Then Morin asked him to tell him all over again. Pierre was struck by Morin's heavy sighs as he repeated the story. When he came the second time to the note, Morin tried to write the words down, but either he was not a good ready scholar, or his fingers trembled too much.
Pierre hardly remembered, but at any rate the lad had to do it, with his wicked reading and writing. When this was done, Morin sat heavily silent. Pierre would have preferred the expected outburst, for this impenetrable gloom perplexed and baffled him. He had even to speak to his cousin, to rouse him. And when he replied, what he said had so little apparent connection with the subject which Pierre had expected to find uppermost in his mind, that he was half afraid that his cousin had lost his wits. "My aunt is out of coffee." "I am sure I do not know," said Pierre.
"Yes, she is. I heard her say so. Tell her that a friend of mine has just opened a shop in the Rue Saint Ouen, and that if she will join me there in 1 hour, I will supply her with a good stock of coffee, just to give my friend encouragement. His name is Antoine Meyer, number 150 at the sign of the Cap of Liberty."
"I could go with you now. I can carry a few pounds of coffee better than my mother," said Pierre, all in good faith. He told me he should never forget the look on his cousin's face as he turned round and bade him begone, and give his mother the message without another word. It had evidently sent him home promptly to obey his cousin's command. Morin's message perplexed Madame Babette. "How could he know I was out of coffee?" said she. "I am, but I am only used the last up this morning. How could Victor know about it?" "I'm sure I can't tell," said Pierre, who by this time had recovered his usual self-possession. "All I know is that monsieur is in a pretty temper, and that if you are not sharp to the time, to this Antoine Meyer's, you are likely to come in for some of his black looks. Well, it is very kind of him to offer to give me some coffee, to be sure, but how could he know I was out?" Pierre hurried his mother off impatiently, for he was certain that the offer of the coffee was only a blind to some hidden purpose on his cousin's part, and he made no doubt that when his mother had been informed of what his cousin's real intention was, he, Pierre, could extract it from her by coaxing or bullying. But he was mistaken. Madame Babette returned home grave, depressed, silent, and loaded with the best coffee. Some time afterwards he learnt why his cousin had sought for this interview. It was to extract from her, by promises and threats, the real name of Mademoiselle Cannes, which would give him a clue to the true appellation of the faithful cousin. He concealed the second purpose from his aunt, who had been quite unaware of his jealousy of the Norman farmer, or of his identification of him with any relation of Virginie's. But Madame Babette instinctively shrank from giving him any information. She must have felt that, in the lowering mood in which she found him, his desire for greater knowledge of Virginie's antecedents boded her no good. And yet he made his aunt his confidante. He told her what she had only suspected before, that he was deeply enamoured of Mademoiselle Cannes, and would gladly marry her. He spoke to Madame Babette of his father's hoarded riches, and of the share which he, as partner, had in them at the present time, and of the prospect of the succession to the whole, which he had as only child. He told his aunt of the provision of her, Madame Babette's, life, which he would make on the day when he married Mademoiselle Cannes. And yet, Babette saw that in his eye and look, which made her more and more reluctant to confide in him. By and by he tried threats. She should leave the conciergerie, and find employment where she liked. Still silence. Then he grew angry, and swore that he would inform her at the bureau of the Directory for harbouring an aristocrat. An aristocrat he knew Mademoiselle was, whatever her real name might be. His aunt should have a domiciliary visit, and see how she liked that. The officers of the government were the people for finding out secrets. In vain she reminded him that by doing so he would expose to imminent danger the lady whom he had professed to love. He told her, with a sullen relapse into silence after his vehement outpouring of passion, never to trouble herself about that. At last he wearied out the old woman, and frightened alike of herself and of him, she told him all. That Mademoiselle Cannes was Mademoiselle Virginie de Crequy, daughter of the Count of that name. Who was the Count? Younger brother of the Marquis. Where was the Marquis? Dead long ago, leaving a widow and child. A son? Eagerly. Yes, a son. Where was he? Pablo? How should she know? For her courage returned a little as the talk went away from the only person of the De Crequy family that she cared about. By dint of some small glasses out of a bottle of Antoine Meyer's, she told him more about the De Crequys than she liked afterwards to remember, for the exhilaration of the brandy lasted but a very short time, and she came home, as I have said, depressed, with a presentiment of coming evil. She would not answer Pierre, but cuffed him about in a manner to which the spoilt boy was quite unaccustomed. His cousin's short, angry words, and sudden withdrawal of confidence, his mother's unwonted crossness and fault-finding, all made Virginie's kind, gentle treatment more than ever charming to the lad. He half resolved to tell her how he had been acting as a spy upon her actions, and at whose desire he had done it. But he was afraid of Morin, and of the vengeance which he was sure would fall upon him for any breach of confidence. Towards 8:30 that evening, Pierre, watching, saw Virginie arrange several little things. She was in the inner room, but he sat where he could see her through the glazed partition. His mother sat, apparently sleeping, in the great easy chair. Virginie moved about softly for fear of disturbing her. She made up one or two little parcels of the few things she could call her own. One packet she concealed about herself, the others she directed, and left on the shelf. She is going, thought Pierre, and as he said in giving me the account, his heart gave a spring, to think that he should never see her again. If either his mother or his cousin had been more kind to him, he might have endeavoured to intercept her. But as it was, he held his breath, and when she came out, he pretended to read, scarcely knowing whether he wished her to succeed in the purpose which he was almost sure she entertained, or not. She stopped by him, and passed her hand over his hair. He told me that his eyes filled with tears at this caress. Then she stood for a moment looking at the sleeping Madame Babette, and stooped down and softly kissed her on the forehead. Pierre dreaded lest his mother should awake, for by this time the wayward, vacillating boy must have been quite on Virginie's side. But the brandy she had drunk made her slumber heavily. Virginie went. Pierre's heart beat fast. He was sure his cousin would try to intercept her, but how he could not imagine. He longed to run out and see the catastrophe, but he had let the moment slip. He was also afraid of reawakening his mother to her unusual state of anger and violence. End of chapter 7 of My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. Read by Capricia Page.
Chapter 8 of My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annie. My Lady Ludlow by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 8. Pierre went on pretending to read, but in reality listening with acute tension of ear to every little sound. His perceptions became so sensitive in this respect that he was incapable of measuring time. Every moment had seemed so full of noises, from the beating of his heart up to the roll of the heavy carts in the distance. He wondered whether Virginie would have reached the place of rendezvous, and yet he was unable to compute the passage of minutes. His mother slept soundly, that was well. By this time Virginie must have met the faithful cousin, if indeed Morin had not made his appearance. At length he felt as if he could no longer sit still, awaiting the issue, but must run out and see what course events had taken. In vain his mother, half rousing herself, called after him to ask whither he was going. He was already out of hearing before she had ended her sentence, and he ran on until, stopped by the sight of Mademoiselle Cannes walking along at so swift a pace that it was almost a run, while at her side, resolutely keeping by her, Morin was striding abreast. Pierre had just turned the corner of the street when he came upon them. Virginie would have passed him without recognising him, she was in such passionate agitation, but for Morin's gesture, by which he would fain have kept Pierre from interrupting them. Then, when Virginie saw the lad, she caught at his arm and thanked God, as if in that boy of 12 or 14 she held a protector. Pierre felt her tremble from head to foot, and was afraid lest she would fall there where she stood in the hard rough street. "Begone, Pierre," said Morin. "I cannot," replied Pierre, who indeed was held firmly by Virginie. "Besides, I won't," he added. "Who has been frightening mademoiselle in this way?" asked he, very much inclined to brave his cousin at all hazards. "Mademoiselle is not accustomed to walk in the streets alone," said Morin sulkily. "She came upon a crowd attracted by the arrest of an aristocrat, and their cries alarmed her. I offered to take charge of her home. Mademoiselle should not walk in these streets alone. We are not like the cold-blooded people of the Faubourg Saint-Germain." Virginie did not speak. Pierre doubted if she heard a word of what they were saying. She leant upon him more and more heavily. "Will mademoiselle condescend to take my arm?" said Morin, with sulky and yet humble uncouthness. I dare say he would have given worlds if he might have had that little hand within his arm, but though she still kept silence, she shuddered up away from him, as you shrink from touching a toad. He had said something to her during that walk, you may be sure, which had made her loathe him. He marked and understood the gesture. He held himself aloof while Pierre gave her all the assistance he could in their slow progress homewards, but Morin accompanied her all the same. He had played too desperate a game to be balked now. He had given information against the ci-devant Marquis de Crequy as a returned émigré, to be met with at such a time in such a place. Morin had hoped that all sign of the arrest would have been cleared away before Virginie reached the spot, so swiftly were terrible deeds done in those days. But Clement defended himself desperately. Virginie was punctual to a second, and though the wounded man was borne off to the Abbaye amid a crowd of the unsympathizing jeerers who mingled with the armed officials of the Directory, Morin feared lest Virginie had recognized him, and he would have preferred that she should have thought that the faithful cousin was faithless than that she should have seen him in bloody danger on her account. I suppose he fancied that if Virginie never saw or heard more of him, her imagination would not dwell on his simple disappearance, as it would do if she knew what he was suffering for her sake. At any rate, Pierre saw that his cousin was deeply mortified by the whole tenor of his behaviour during their walk home. When they arrived at Madame Babette's, Virginie fell fainting on the floor. Her strength had but just sufficed for this exertion of reaching the shelter of the house. Her first sign of restoring consciousness consisted in avoidance of Morin. He had been most assiduous in his efforts to bring her round, quite tender in his way, Pierre said, and this marked instinctive repugnance to him evidently gave him extreme pain. I suppose Frenchmen are more demonstrative than we are, for Pierre declared that he saw his cousin's eyes fill with tears as she shrank away from his touch if he tried to arrange the shawl they had laid under her head like a pillow, or as she shut her eyes when he passed before her. Madame Babette was urgent with her to go and lie down on the bed in the inner room, but it was some time before she was strong enough to rise and do this. When Madame Babette returned from arranging the girl comfortably, the three relations sat down in silence, a silence which Pierre thought would never be broken. He wanted his mother to ask his cousin what had happened, but Madame Babette was afraid of her nephew, and thought it more discreet to wait for such crumbs of intelligence as he might think fit to throw to her. But, after she had twice reported Virginie to be asleep, without a word being uttered in reply to her whispers by either of her companions, Morin's powers of self-containment gave way. "It is hard," he said. "What is hard?" asked Madame Babette, after she had paused for a time to enable him to add to or to finish his sentence if he pleased. "It is hard for a man to love a woman as I do," he went on. "I did not seek to love her. It came upon me before I was aware. Before I had ever thought about it at all, I loved her better than all the world beside. All my life before I knew her seems a dull blank. I neither know nor care for what I did before then. And now there are just 2 lives before me. Either I have her, or I have not. That is all, but that is everything. And what can I do to make her have me? Tell me, aunt." And he caught at Madame Babette's arm, and gave it so sharp a shake that she half screamed out, Pierre said, and evidently grew alarmed at her nephew's excitement. "Hush, Victor," said she. "There are other women in the world, if this one will not have you." None other for me, he said, sinking back as if hopeless. I am plain and coarse, not one of the scented darlings of the aristocrats. Say that I am ugly, brutish. I did not make myself so, any more than I made myself love her. It is my fate. But am I to submit to the consequences of my fate without a struggle? Not I. As strong as my love is, so strong is my will. It can be no stronger, continued he gloomily. Aunt Babette, you must help me. You must make her love me. He was so fierce here that Pierre said he did not wonder that his mother was frightened. I, Victor, she exclaimed. I make her love you? How can I? Ask me to speak for you to Mademoiselle Didot, or to Mademoiselle Cauchois even, or to such as they, and I'll do it and welcome. But to Mademoiselle de Crequy, why, you don't know the difference. Those people, the old nobility, I mean, why, they don't know a man from a dog out of their own rank. And no wonder, for the young gentlemen of quality are treated differently to us from their very birth. If she had you to-morrow, you would be miserable. Let me alone for knowing the aristocracy. I have not been a concierge to a duke and 3 counts for nothing. I tell you, all your ways are different to her ways. I would change my ways, as you call them. Be reasonable, Victor. No, I will not be reasonable, if by that you mean giving her up. I tell you, 2 lives are before me, one with her, one without her. But the latter will be but a short career for both of us. You said, aunt, that the talk went in the conciergerie of her father's hotel, that she would have nothing to do with this cousin whom I put out of the way to-day? So the servants said. How could I know? All I know is that he left off coming to our hotel, and that at one time before then he had never been 2 days absent. So much the better for him. He suffers now for having come between me and my object, in trying to snatch her away out of my sight. Take you warning, Pierre. I did not like your meddling to-night. And so he went off, leading Madame Babette rocking herself backwards and forwards in all the depression of spirits consequent upon the reaction after the brandy, and upon her knowledge of her nephew's threatened purpose combined. In telling you most of this, I have simply repeated Pierre's account, which I wrote down at the time. But here what he had to say came to a sudden break, for, the next morning when Madame Babette rose, Virginie was missing, and it was some time before either she, or Pierre, or Morin could get the slightest clue to the missing girl. And now I must take up the story as it was told to the Intendant Flechier by the old gardener Jacques, with whom Clement had been lodging on his first arrival in Paris. The old man could not, I dare say, remember half as much of what had happened as Pierre did. The former had the dulled memory of age, while Pierre had evidently thought over the whole series of events as a story, as a play, if one may call it so, during the solitary hours in his afterlife, wherever they were passed, whether in lonely camp-watches, or in the foreign prison, where he had to drag out many years. Clement had, as I said, returned to the gardener's garret after he had been dismissed from the Hôtel du Guesclin. There were several reasons for his thus doubling back. One was that he put nearly the whole breadth of Paris between him and an enemy, though why Morin was an enemy, and to what extent he carried his dislike or hatred, Clement could not tell, of course. The next reason for returning to Jacques was no doubt the conviction that in multiplying his residences he multiplied the chances against his being suspected and recognised. And then, again, the old man was in his secret and his ally, although perhaps but a feeble kind of one. It was through Jacques that the plan of communication by means of a nosegay of pinks had been devised, and it was Jacques who procured him the last disguise that Clement was to use in Paris, as he hoped and trusted. It was that of a respectable shopkeeper of no particular class, a dress that would have seemed perfectly suitable to the young man who would naturally have worn it, and yet, as Clement put it on and adjusted it, giving it a sort of finish and elegance which I always noticed about his appearance, and which I believed was innate in the wearer, I have no doubt it seemed like the usual apparel of a gentleman. No coarseness of texture nor clumsiness of cut could disguise the nobleman of 30 descents, it appeared, for immediately on arriving at the place of rendezvous he was recognised by the men placed there on Morin's information to seize him. Jacques, following at a little distance, with a bundle under his arm containing articles of feminine disguise for Virginie, saw 4 men attempt Clement's arrest, saw him, quick as lightning, draw a sword hitherto concealed in a clumsy stick, saw his agile figure spring to his guard, and saw him defend himself with the rapidity and art of a man skilled in arms. But what good did it do, as Jacques piteously used to ask, Monsieur Flechier told me. A great blow from a heavy club on the sword-arm of Monsieur de Crequy laid it helpless and immovable by his side. Jacques always thought that that blow came from one of the spectators, who by this time had collected round the scene of the affray. The next instant his master, his little Marquis, was down among the feet of the crowd, and though he was up again before he had received much damage, so active and light was my poor Clement, it was not before the old gardener had hobbled forwards, and with many an old-fashioned oath and curse, proclaimed himself a partisan of the losing side, a follower of a ci devant aristocrat. It was quite enough. He received 1 or 2 good blows, which were, in fact, aimed at his master, and then, almost before he was aware, he found his arms pinioned behind him with a woman's garter, which one of the viragos in the crowd had made no scruple of pulling off in public as soon as she heard for what purpose it was wanted. Poor Jacques was stunned and unhappy. His master was out of sight, on before, and the old gardener scarce knew whither they were taking him. His head ached from the blows which had fallen upon it. It was growing dark, June day though it was, and when first he seems to have become exactly aware of what had happened to him, it was when he was turned into one of the larger rooms of the Abbaye, in which all were put who had no other allotted place wherein to sleep. 1 or 2 iron lamps hung from the ceiling by chains, giving a dim light for a little circle. Jacques stumbled forwards over a sleeping body lying on the ground. The sleeper wakened up enough to complain, and the apology of the old man in reply caught the ear of his master, who, until this time, could hardly have been aware of the straits and difficulties of his faithful Jacques. And there they sat, against a pillar the livelong night, holding one another's hands, and each restraining expressions of pain, for fear of adding to the other's distress. That night made them intimate friends, in spite of the difference of age and rank. The disappointed hopes, the acute suffering of the present, the apprehensions of the future, made them seek solace in talking of the past. Monsieur de Crequy and the gardener found themselves disputing with interest in which chimney of the stack the starling used to build, the starling whose nest Clement sent to Uriens, you remember, and discussing the merits of different espalier pears, which grew, and may grow still, in the old garden of the Hôtel de Crequy. Towards morning both fell asleep. The old man wakened first. His frame was deadened to suffering, I suppose, for he felt relieved of his pain, but Clement moaned and cried in feverish slumber. His broken arm was beginning to inflame his blood. He was, besides, much injured by some kicks from the crowd as he fell. As the old man looked sadly on the white baked lips and the flushed cheeks, contorted with suffering even in his sleep, Clement gave a sharp cry which disturbed his miserable neighbours, all slumbering around in uneasy attitudes. They bade him with curses be silent, and then, turning round, tried again to forget their own misery in sleep. For you see, the bloodthirsty canaille had not been sated with guillotining and hanging all the nobility they could find, but were now informing right and left, even against each other, and when Clement and Jacques were in the prison, there were few of gentle blood in the place, and fewer still of gentle manners. At the sound of the angry words and threats, Jacques thought it best to awaken his master from his feverish uncomfortable sleep, lest he should provoke more enmity, and, tenderly lifting him up, he tried to adjust his own body so that it should serve as a rest and a pillow for the younger man. The motion aroused Clement, and he began to talk in a strange feverish way, of Virginie too, whose name he would not have breathed in such a place had he been quite himself. But Jacques had as much delicacy of feeling as any lady in the land, although, mind you, he knew neither how to read nor write, and he bent his head low down so that his master might tell him in a whisper what messages he was to take to Mademoiselle de Crequy, in case, poor Clement, he knew it must come to that, no escape for him now, in Norman disguise or otherwise. Either by gathering fever or guillotine, death was sure of his prey. Well, when that happened, Jacques was to go and find Mademoiselle de Crequy, and tell her that her cousin loved her at the last as he had loved her at the first, but that she should never have heard another word of his attachment from his living lips, that he knew he was not good enough for her, his queen, and that no thought of earning her love by his devotion had prompted his return to France, only that, if possible, he might have the great privilege of serving her whom he loved. And then he went off into rambling talk about petit maître, and such kind of expressions, said Jacques to Flechier, the intendant, little knowing what a clue that one word gave to much of the poor lad's suffering. The summer morning came slowly on in that dark prison, and when Jacques could look round, his master was now sleeping on his shoulder, still the uneasy starting sleep of fever, he saw that there were many women among the prisoners. I have heard some of those who have escaped from the prisons say that the look of despair and agony that came into the faces of the prisoners on first wakening, as the sense of their situation grew upon them, was what lasted the longest in the memory of the survivors. This look, they said, passed away from the women's faces sooner than it did from those of the men. Poor old Jacques kept falling asleep, and plucking himself up again, for fear lest, if he did not attend to his master, some harm might come to the swollen helpless arm. Yet his weariness grew upon him in spite of all his efforts, and at last he felt as if he must give way to the irresistible desire, if only for 5 minutes. But just then there was a bustle at the door. Jacques opened his eyes wide to look. "The gaoler is early with breakfast," said someone lazily. "It is the darkness of this accursed place that makes us think it early," said another. All this time a parley was going on at the door. Someone came in, not the gaoler, a woman. The door was shut to and locked behind her. She only advanced a step or two, for it was too sudden a change out of the light into that dark shadow for any one to see clearly for the first few minutes. Jacques had his eyes fairly open now, and was wide awake. It was Mademoiselle de Crequy, looking bright, clear, and resolute. The faithful heart of the old man read that look like an open page. Her cousin should not die there on her behalf without at least the comfort of her sweet presence. "Here he is," he whispered, as her gown would have touched him in passing without her perceiving him, in the heavy obscurity of the place. "The good God bless you, my friend," she murmured, as she saw the attitude of the old man, propped against a pillar and holding Clement in his arms, as if the young man had been a helpless baby, while one of the poor gardener's hands supported the broken limb in the easiest position. Virginie sat down by the old man and held out her arms. Softly she moved Clement's head to her own shoulder. Softly she transferred the task of holding the arm to herself. Clement lay on the floor, but she supported him, and Jacques was at liberty to arise and stretch and shake his stiff, weary old body. He then sat down at a little distance and watched the pair until he fell asleep. Clement had muttered "Virginie," as they half roused him by their movements out of his stupor, but Jacques thought he was only dreaming, nor did he seem fully awake when once his eyes opened and he looked full at Virginie's face bending over him, and growing crimson under his gaze, though she never stirred, for fear of hurting him if she moved. Clement looked in silence until his heavy eyelids came slowly down, and he fell into his oppressive slumber again. Either he did not recognize her, or she came in too completely as a part of his sleeping visions for him to be disturbed by her appearance there. When Jacques awoke it was full daylight, at least as full as it would ever be in that place. His breakfast, the jail allowance of bread and vin ordinaire, was by his side. He must have slept soundly. He looked for his master. He and Virginie had recognized each other now, hearts as well as appearance. They were smiling into each other's faces, as if that dull vaulted room in the grim Abbaye were the sunny gardens of Versailles, with music and festivity all abroad. Apparently they had much to say to each other, for whispered questions and answers never ceased. Virginie had made a sling for the poor broken arm. Nay, she had obtained 2 splinters of wood in some way, and one of their fellow prisoners, having, it appeared, some knowledge of surgery, had set it. Jacques felt more desponding by far than they did, for he was suffering from the night he had passed, which told upon his aged frame, while they must have heard some good news, as it seemed to him, so bright and happy did they look. Yet Clement was still in bodily pain and suffering, and Virginie by her own act and deed was a prisoner in that dreadful Abbaye, whence the only issue was the guillotine. But they were together, they loved, they understood each other at length. When Virginie saw that Jacques was awake and languidly munching his breakfast, she rose from the wooden stool on which she was sitting and went to him, holding out both hands and refusing to allow him to rise, while she thanked him with pretty eagerness for all his kindness to Monsieur. Monsieur himself came towards him, following Virginie, but with tottering steps, as if his head was weak and dizzy, to thank the poor old man, who now on his feet stood between them, ready to cry while they gave him credit for faithful actions which he felt to have been almost involuntary on his part. For loyalty was like an instinct in the good old days, before your educational cant had come up. And so 2 days went on. The only event was the morning call for the victims, a certain number of whom was summoned to trial every day, and to be tried was to be condemned. Every one of the prisoners became grave as the hour for their summons approached. Most of the victims went to their doom with uncomplaining resignation, and for a while after their departure there was comparative silence in the prison. But by and by, so said Jacques, the conversation or amusements began again. Human nature cannot stand the perpetual pressure of such keen anxiety without an effort to relieve itself by thinking of something else. Jacques said that Monsieur and Mademoiselle were for ever talking together of the past days. It was, "Do you remember this?" or "Do you remember that?" perpetually. He sometimes thought they forgot where they were, and what was before them. But Jacques did not, and every day he trembled more and more as the list was called over. The third morning of their incarceration, the gaoler brought in a man whom Jacques did not recognise, and therefore did not at once observe, for he was waiting, as in duty bound, upon his master and his sweet young lady, as he always called her in repeating the story. He thought that the new introduction was some friend of the gaoler, as the two seemed well acquainted, and the latter stayed a few minutes talking with his visitor before leaving him in prison. So Jacques was surprised when, after a short time had elapsed, he looked round and saw the fierce stare with which the stranger was regarding Monsieur and Mademoiselle de Crequy as the pair sat at breakfast, the said breakfast being laid, as well as Jacques knew how, on a bench fastened into the prison wall, Virginie sitting on her low stool, and Clement half lying on the ground by her side, and submitting gladly to be fed by her pretty white fingers, for it was one of her fancies, Jacques said, to do all she could for him, in consideration of his broken arm. And indeed Clement was wasting away daily, for he had received other injuries, internal and more serious than that to his arm, during the mêlée which had ended in his capture. The stranger made Jacques conscious of his presence by a sigh, which was almost a groan. All three prisoners looked round at the sound. Clement's face expressed little but scornful indifference, but Virginie's face froze into stony hate. Jacques said he never saw such a look, and hoped that he never should again. Yet after that first revelation of feeling, her look was steady and fixed in another direction to that in which the stranger stood, still motionless, still watching. He came a step nearer at last. "Mademoiselle," he said. Not the quivering of an eyelash showed that she heard him. "Mademoiselle," he said again, with an intensity of beseeching that made Jacques, not knowing who he was, almost pity him when he saw his young lady's obdurate face. There was perfect silence for a space of time which Jacques could not measure. Then again the voice, hesitatingly, saying, "Monsieur?" Clement could not hold the same icy countenance as Virginie. He turned his head with an impatient gesture of disgust, but even that emboldened the man. "Monsieur, do ask mademoiselle to listen to me. Just 2 words." "Mademoiselle de Crequy only listens to whom she chooses." Very haughtily may Clement would say that, I am sure. "But mademoiselle," lowering his voice and coming a step or two nearer. Virginie must have felt his approach, though she did not see it, for she drew herself a little on the one side, so as to put as much space as possible between him and her. "Mademoiselle, it is not too late. I can save you. But tomorrow your name is down on the list. I can save you if you will listen." Still no word or sign. Jacques did not understand the affair. Why was she so obdurate to one who might be ready to include Clement in the proposal as far as Jacques knew? The man withdrew a little, but did not offer to leave the prison. He never took his eyes off Virginie. He seemed to be suffering from some acute and terrible pain as he watched her. Jacques cleared away the breakfast things as well as he could. Purposely, as I suspect, he passed near the man. "Hist!" said the stranger. "You are Jacques, the gardener, arrested for assisting an aristocrat. I know the gaoler. You shall escape if you will. Only take this message from me to mademoiselle. You heard. She will not listen to me. I did not want her to come here. I never knew she was here, and she will die tomorrow. They will put her beautiful round throat under the guillotine. Tell her, good old man, tell her how sweet life is, and how I can save her, and how I will not ask for more than just to see her from time to time. She is so young, and death is annihilation, you know. Why does she hate me so? I want to save her. I have done her no harm. Good old man, tell her how terrible death is, and that she will die tomorrow, unless she listens to me." Jacques saw no harm in repeating this message. Clement listened in silence, watching Virginie with an air of infinite tenderness. "Will you not try him, my cherished one?" he said. "Towards you he may mean well," which makes me think that Virginie had never repeated to Clement the conversation which she had overheard that last night at Madame Babette's. "You would be in no worse a situation than you were before." "No worse, Clement, and I should have known that you were, and have lost you. My Clement," said she reproachfully. "Ask him," said she, turning to Jacques suddenly, "if he can save Monsieur de Crequy as well. If he can, oh, Clement, we might escape to England. We are but young." And she hid her face in his shoulder. Jacques returned to the stranger and asked him Virginie's question. His eyes were fixed on the cousins. He was very pale, and the twitchings or contortions, which must have been involuntary whenever he was agitated, convulsed his whole body. He made a long pause. "I will save mademoiselle and monsieur if she will go straight from prison to the Mairie and be my wife." "Your wife!" Jacques could not help exclaiming. "That she will never be, never." "Ask her," said Morin hoarsely. But almost before Jacques thought he could have fairly uttered the words, Clement caught their meaning. "Begone," said he, "not one word more." Virginie touched the old man as he was moving away. Tell him he does not know how he makes me welcome death." And smiling as if triumphant, she turned again to Clement. The stranger did not speak as Jacques gave him the meaning, not the words, of their replies. He was going away, but stopped. A minute or two afterwards he beckoned to Jacques. The old gardener seems to have thought it undesirable to throw away even the chance of assistance from such a man as this, for he went forward to speak to him. "Listen, I have influence with the jailer. He shall let thee pass out with the victims to-morrow. No one will notice it, or miss thee. They will be led to trial. Even at the last moment I will save her if she sends me word she relents. Speak to her as the time draws on. Life is very sweet. Tell her how sweet. Speak to him. He will do more with her than thou canst. Let him urge her to live. Even at the last I will be at the Palais de Justice, at the Grève. I have followers, I have interest. Come among the crowd that follow the victims. I shall see thee. It will be no worse for him if she escapes." "Save my master, and I will do all," said Jacques. "Only on my one condition," said Morin doggedly, and Jacques was hopeless of that condition ever being fulfilled. But he did not see why his own life might not be saved. By remaining in prison until the next day, he should have rendered every service in his power to his master and the young lady. He, poor fellow, shrank from death, and he agreed with Morin to escape if he could by the means Morin had suggested, and to bring him word if Mademoiselle de Crequy relented. Jacques had no expectation that she would, but I fancy he did not think it necessary to tell Morin of this conviction of his. This bargaining with so base a man for so slight a thing as life was the only flaw that I heard of in the old gardener's behaviour. Of course, the mere reopening of the subject was enough to stir Virginie to displeasure. Clement urged her, it is true, but the light he had gained upon Morin's motions made him rather try to set the case before her in as fair a manner as possible than use any persuasive arguments. And even as it was, what he said on the subject made Virginie shed tears, the first that had fallen from her since she entered the prison. So they were summoned and went together, at the fatal call of the muster-roll of victims the next morning. He, feeble from his wounds and his injured health; she, calm and serene, only petitioning to be allowed to walk next to him, in order that she might hold him up when he turned faint and giddy from his extreme suffering. Together they stood at the bar, together they were condemned. As the words of judgment were pronounced, Virginie turned to Clement and embraced him with passionate fondness. Then, making him lean on her, they marched out towards the Place de la Grève. Jacques was free now. He had told Morin how fruitless his efforts at persuasion had been, and scarcely caring to note the effect of his information upon the man, he had devoted himself to watching Monsieur and Mademoiselle de Crequy. And now he followed them to the Place de la Grève. He saw them mount the platform, saw them kneel down together, till plucked up by the impatient officials, could see that she was urging some request to the executioner, the end of which seemed to be that Clement advanced first to the guillotine, was executed, and just at this moment there was a stir among the crowd as of a man pressing forwards towards the scaffold. Then she, standing with her face to the guillotine, slowly made the sign of the cross and knelt down. Jacques covered his eyes, blinded with tears. The report of a pistol made him look up. She was gone, another victim in her place, and where there had been a little stir in the crowd not 5 minutes before, some men were carrying off a dead body. A man had shot himself, they said. Pierre told me who that man was. End of chapter 8.